Hi everyone, I'm Scott Kahn and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. As we complete our 7th season of the podcast, I'm pleased to present a classic episode from 3 years ago in which Professor Joshua Berman of Ilan University discusses academic Bible study, biblical criticism, and Orthodox Judaism. It was a very interesting episode which raised crucial questions that Orthodox Jews need to confront, as well as suggestions of how we should do so. Because we soon complete the annual cycle of Torah readings and begin again in less than 2 weeks with parashat Bereshit, this is a good time to revisit this crucial issue. As we leave Yom Kippur behind and look forward to Sukkot, following perhaps the most difficult year that the Jewish people has experienced since the Shoah, I pray that Hashem help us move forward, victorious over those who would want to destroy us, with safety for all of our soldiers, as well as for all Jews across the world. May the upcoming year be one of bracha, besorot tovot, yeshuvot, v'nechamot, blessings, good news, salvation, and consolation. The Orthodox Conundrum will be back with our 8th season soon after Sukkot. Until then, Chag Sameach and enjoy the episode.
All Gdolei Yisrael, since the Rambam onward, their view of the Ikari Emunah has always been guided by one principle, and that is, given where the various Gdolei Yisrael, where I am living, the time that I am living in, the community that I am addressing, what is their spiritual needs? What do I need to tell them about the Ikare Emunah or any one of them that will lead them to greater Yirat Shamayim and Kiyum HaMitzvot? Full stop. It just turns out that in different times, different Gedolim have told different people different things. But that is what has always guided them. And that's what guides us today as well.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Some of the most serious challenges to traditional Orthodox faith come from academic approaches to the Bible, including what's generally termed biblical criticism. The Rambam formulated 13 principles of faith. His 8th principle is succinctly, though inexactly, summarized in the well-known Ani Maamin, which says, I believe with perfect faith that the entire Torah found currently in our possession is that which was given to Moshe, our teacher. While this is far from a perfect summary of the actual words of the Rambam, it's close enough to give anyone who has familiarity with both lower and higher biblical criticism pause. How should a religious Jew relate to academic study of the Torah and the challenges it presents? Are we forced to live with the questions? Or are there compelling approaches which defend the traditional view while also being acceptable in the academy? Should a person stay away from these questions altogether? Or is the search for truth paramount, even as it may be dangerous? To answer these and many other questions, I was honored to speak to Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman is a professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University. A graduate of Princeton University and of Yeshivat Har Etzion, Rabbi Berman is the author of 2 academic books on the 5 books of the Torah. His articles on biblical theology and contemporary society have appeared in the pages of Mosaic magazine and the Wall Street Journal. Rabbi Dr. Berman served as a member of the International Advisory Board for the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. Rabbi Berman's latest book, and the focus of this week's episode of this podcast, is Ani Maamin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Accuracy, and the 13 Principles of Faith. Rabbi Professor Joshua Berman, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you, Scott, and Shavua Tov and Shana Tova to all of our viewers and listeners.
Before we get into the heart of what we're going to talk about today, I want to ask about the book that you published last year entitled Ani Maamin. This book is very important and addresses crucial issues that come up from academic Bible study. Before we get into the specifics about academic approaches to the Torah, some of the problems that are raised by those approaches, and what a religious Jew may respond to them, I want to ask you why you wrote this book. What was your reasoning and the reason that you wrote it now specifically?
Right. So I think that for many, many, many years, this was an issue that maybe people had heard about, but it wasn't really on the agenda, and it wasn't something that very many people had much interest in, let alone really being bothered by it. I recall when I was in yeshiva, I learned in Yeshivat Har Etzion in the mid-'80s, and I remember hearing that there were some fellows that were learning about biblical criticism. And I thought to myself, wow, just to do that, they'd have to get on a bus and travel into Yerushalayim and make their way to the National Library and then figure out, God knows where to go and what to look for. Wow, that's really quite an effort. And that's not the case anymore. You don't have to go on a bus for an hour and to the National Library and figure out what books to. In fact, you don't have to go anywhere. In fact, even if you're not looking for biblical criticism, it comes washing through your computer screen, whether you want to or not. Because if you're on the internet and reading widely, blogs and newspaper sites, this stuff comes up. Just if you're just reading Times of Israel, this stuff that relates to this all the time. And so we are in a different age. And what I discovered with some colleagues about, 10, 15 years ago, really, as we were all getting onto the internet at the same time, is that there were more and more people who were being exposed to this and with very little orientation of what to do with this, because this is not the stuff that you teach, a good Jewish boy and girl. And so no one really had the wherewithal to deal with this. And it just seemed to me that there was a community-wide responsibility for someone. I view myself as first and foremost as a mechanech. It's rabbi professor. That's the order, and that's what it is. Academia is just chinuch by another name. That's how I see it. And so therefore, even if this is, it's actually the book Ani Maamin is based on an academic book that I published with Oxford University Press, but it was important to give it in a presentation that would be more accessible for a wide Jewish audience. And with more of a Jewish orientation. That is, if we discuss the importance of reading and learning the Torah in its ancient Near Eastern context, to show how this is not at all a newfangled idea, that the Rambam did this all the time, and we're really just following here in his footsteps. Mm-hmm. And so I saw that there was a real need for this, and this was a 10-year project. I was kind of shocked even. I was part of a kind of a study group, a think tank, if you want to call it, of prominent religious educators here in Israel and Bible scholars, Dati Bible scholars, who all wanted to get together and kind of find a way to produce something for our community. And what I discovered is that I was the fundamentalist, that I really believed that there was, Torah min hashamayim, and that, Yetzias Mitzrayim really happened. I was like, oh boy, there's a lot of work to do here. And it took 10 years to do the academic version and then an academic version. But the time is right, because more and more people are being exposed to this at all ages and all stages. There are no more walls, no filter on the internet manages to catch biblical criticism.
In that case, what was the response from the Orthodox community per se to the book Ani Maamin? Was it a positive response in general? Was there criticism?
So I would say this, I wrote the book primarily, I guess, Scott, for the type of audience that's listening here today. People who, broadly speaking, would identify themselves as either Dati Le'umi or modern Orthodox or, Central Orthodox, a YU orientation. And I'm pleased that it has received a very warm response there. I get emails daily about this stuff, or Facebook messages. But what's really shocked me has been the response to the left and to the right.
What do you mean?
To the left, I have a standing invitation to present the material in the book as a course at JTS. And what I've discovered is that there are a lot of liberal Jews, conservative and Reform Jews, or Reconstructionist, or other denominations that are out there, who are really looking to see, well, to what extent does the Torah really hold together? To what extent is there evidence for the historical accuracy of what's going on here? And even though they might have, they might be open to critical approaches. What I'm doing is also a critical approach. This is not apologetics. I am using the tools of academia to make these arguments. And as I said before, this all appeared first in a book that I put out with Oxford University Press. So that's on the left. And some other groups also, the rabbinical groups from AJS, which is roughly similar, at least for those of us in the Orthodox world, to JTS. And I had a Meet the Author meeting over Zoom with about a dozen of their rabbinic alumni, and they were very excited about it. So that shocked me. The people on the left would not just be out there, seeking to uphold at all costs JEP&D, and no, it was not from Sinai, and nothing was from Sinai, and it's not from God. No, they also want to feel, where is the divinity in this work? But the even bigger surprise, Scott, has been from the right.
Interesting.
Has been from the right.
What was the response from the right?
The right is not monolithic anymore, as we all know.
Mm-hmm.
There's no Gadol Hador that I know of that has come out and said, everyone has to go buy this book and put it, next to their shtender in the Beis HaMedrash. No, that hasn't happened. But, a lot of the yeshivish world now today is, there's a lot going on under the shtender, as they say. A lot that goes on online in quiet conversations between people, neighbors, and between people over the internet. And I have a long list of the yeshivas whose graduates, or where people are still learning, who reach out to me with interest about this material and are very thankful for the book, including Gateshead and the Mir and Rav Tzvi's and Lakewood and Skokie, and I could go on and on. I have a group of fellows from Williamsburg, Satmar Hasidim, who invited me. I spent a Shabbos in Williamsburg talking to dozens of full Satmar, not former Satmar, not, unorthodox Satmar, people who are living there deep in the community, who want to be deep in the community.
Authentic Satmar.
But yes, the whole bit, and it was great. And they're very open-minded. You see, what's happening in a lot of the Haredi world is this, because so many people are online, whether that's mutter or not mutter, in their world, but they're online. And a lot of people in that world have not been given the wherewithal to deal with modernity. You see, some versions of the yeshivish world are very good at this, especially Chabad and Breslov. They might not have particular answers, what do you say about J and E? But they give their followers an orientation to modernity and its challenges and what to do. And then there are other parts of the Haredi world, both the Litvish world and the Hasidic world, where they just have their blinders on, where it's like, we're just going to do and think whatever we've always done, and that will be enough. And we don't have new challenges, and therefore we don't need new resources. And it's leaving a lot of their faithful, with real questions, because people want to serve a Kadosh Baruch Hu la'avdecha be'emes. They want to serve with the midah of truth. And when they see, intelligent questions, not all questions posed by biblical critics are anti-Semitism. It's just not so. And they know it. And therefore they're in an honest search to serve a Kadosh Baruch Hu with the midah of emes. And therefore I've received lots and lots of positive response and interaction thereafter from the book on the right.
Oh, that's wonderful. What you just said reminds me of something I read in Rabbi Amnon Bazak's book, Ad Hayom Hazeh, where he describes answering some of these questions the way that the Rishonim do. Rashi will address some of these questions as well. And he says, I think very courageously and honestly, said, essentially, im kabbalahu nekabel, if this works, that's fine. But we have to be honest. Just because Rashi or the Ramban or the Ibn Ezra answers a question, we have to say, okay, but does he answer it compellingly enough for the specific academic question at stake, such that I say, oh, that really does answer the question? Or is it that I'm already assuming that I know what the answer is, and therefore this answer is working within a system? Would it effectively, I guess he means, satisfy an academic? So I see what you mean in terms of the need to address them honestly, and not every answer is so simple. So I'd like to get in right now to the parsha we just read, because let's talk about the meat of the book and the meat of the issue. We just finished parashat Bereshit. It was one of the most famous examples of one of the academic approaches apparently conflicting with the classic Chazal approach, which Rav Soloveitchik famously addressed in The Lonely Man of Faith. We have, for example, apparently two stories of creation, Perek Aleph and Perek Bet, maybe even more than two, and they don't say the same thing. They're literally different. They have different names of God. They're style is different, the story is different. So using that as a backdrop, how would you, as an academic using the tools of academia, respond as a religious Jew?
Right. So, and it's, I would just go even further. It's not just that the stories are different. They contradict. They contradict in terms of the order in which things were created. It's really hard to mesh it all into one chronological, coherent story of how the world was created. So this is a wonderful example, Scott, of one of the major fault lines and drawbacks of how Bible critics work. And that is that they say, okay, we have what appears to our eyes to be something that we would call an inconsistency or a fissure, meaning a break in the text. Nobody would write this way. Nobody would write two contradictory stories. And therefore, the conclusion must be that the materials here, Perek Aleph and Perek Bet, originate from different hands, from different authors, and maybe they were somehow brought together at a later point. Now, the original sin here is the belief by many critics, nearly all, I would say, that do this type of work, is that the Bible critic, possess an understanding of literary unity. I know, I just need to read honestly, and I can tell when something coheres, it holds together nicely, and when something is jarring and inconsistent. And my standards of what that would be are clearly what any writing and thinking person would have thought at any time in history. And therefore, it's all the same. If it doesn't work for me, then it couldn't have ever worked for anybody. This is now, we now know, we can document this as untrue, that aesthetics about what we wear, aesthetics about how we look, aesthetics about how we decorate our homes, aesthetics about the music we listen to, and aesthetics about how we write change from culture to culture. That is clear. But what is especially clear and important for our discussion is that when we look at other writings from other cultures, from the time of the Tanakh, where we know with absolute certainty that compositions that we're familiar with from these other cultures were written by one single person or one authority who authorized the composition of a certain text, we find all of these types of quote unquote inconsistencies and contradictions within those very same compositions, which means that their sense of literary unity was different than our own. I'll give an example in a moment. Our notion of literary unity, whether we know it or not, whether we've heard the name or not, is all of us who are speaking English, who were raised in the West, our notion of, that looks like it's a contradiction. That comes from Aristotle. Aristotle had a work called the Poetics. You maybe never read the Poetics, but believe me, if you are breathing Western air, your notion of what is consistent or what is inconsistent is Aristotle's. And malasot, what can we do? The writers of ancient Israel didn't read Aristotle. Okay, I'll give you one example of this outside of Israel.
Yes, please.
Okay. So a lot of scholars, yours truly included, believe that the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and we can talk about the historical accuracy of the Exodus as we move on, but for this portion of the conversation, it doesn't really matter, was the greatest Pharaoh of ancient Egypt, Ramses II, Ramses the Great. Ramses the Great, if you asked him, and you can ask him, you can ask his mummy because it's on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you were to ask him, what was your greatest achievement? We know what the answer would be. He had this huge battle against his arch enemy, the Hittite Empire, in 1274 BCE. Ramses the Great ruled for about 80 years. And when he comes back from that battle against the Hittites, who were in modern-day Turkey, he plasters all of Egypt with accounts of this battle. It's actually the ancient event that is more publicized in ancient times than any other event. By that, I mean, if we take the destruction of the Second Temple, and we know that in Rome, and many of us have visited there, you can go to the Arch of Titus, right? And you can see a commemoration of the destruction of Jerusalem. One commemoration. There is one Arch of Titus, okay? In Egypt, we know of at least 10 places where Ramses II put up accounts of the battle of Kadesh, it's called, not Kadesh Barnea, which we have in Chumash, but Kadesh that's located in modern-day Syria, against the Hittites. 10 different accounts. that he wrote. And what we see about that in 10 different places, 10 accounts in 10 different places. In many of those places, one right next to the other, he puts up differing accounts of the battle, sometimes two and sometimes three differing, contradicting accounts of that battle. And you say, wait a minute, and we know because these monuments are built all at once, that it's all written at the same time. So what's going on here? And what Egyptologists say, lahavdil, is what Rav Soloveitchik said about Bereshit Aleph and Bereshit Bet, that each account is coming to highlight a different idea, a different message, and therefore it takes liberty with some of the details in order to highlight that message. So in the case of the Battle of Kadesh, one account highlights the salvation that Ramses II felt that he was getting from his god Amun. The second account highlights his gevura, his bravery, as he single-handedly, so it says, took on 2,500 Hittite chariots, and of course he won. If you look in the Hittite sources, they have a different story, but that's neither here nor there. And then the third account highlights the bravery of one particular brigade of Egyptian troops that was there at the site. So that what they would do back then is that in order to highlight different messages, they wrote the story in slightly different ways. Or as someone recently put it to me very beautifully, ancient writers, what they were engaging in was painting, not photography. So that they take some liberties with it. And let me just say for listeners that are out there like, whoa, wait a minute, Rabbi Berman, what you're suggesting then is that maybe Bereshit Aleph isn't 100% factually true, and maybe even Bereshit Bet isn't 100% factually true, and that we've kind of moved around, we're playing with the facts a little bit. Yes, that is exactly what's going on. And I'm not the first to say this. Rav Kook said this, okay? Rav Kook writes, he has a work called Ein Ayah. It's a book, it's a work about Agadah on Shas. He didn't get very far through Shas with it, but in Masechet Shabbat, he says the following line. He says, and he was a modern person. These issues of biblical criticism, historical accuracy were already very present in his time.
They existed in his day, of course.
Turn of the century, yeah. And he says the following. He says, all stories in the Tanakh are written for the purpose of inculcating a message to the soul of the reader or the listener of the story. When the Tanakh feels, and by this he includes the Torah, says this explicitly, when the Torah feels that a mere presentation of the facts exactly as they happened, without any change, will suffice to leave the necessary imprint on the soul of the person learning Chumash, then the Torah makes do with just the facts. But when the message that the Torah wants to give over will be best imparted by embellishing those facts a little bit, what he calls a levush, the Torah has no qualms with imposing a levush on the basic core of the story, which remains and which is true. There you have it.
There's a huge amount to unpack over here. So I want to go through just step by step and understand a few things. Let's first speak about that last idea you mentioned in the name of Rav Kook. So I want to make sure I'm expressing this properly. We should not view the Torah as history necessarily. Is that a fair statement? That
is a fair statement. Let me expand on that. All these things need to be expanded. But let me throw out what's a real shocker. Okay, I always love it when you have words that for us are just so obvious and familiar, and you think everybody who lived any time in the course of human history must have had a word for X or Y or Z. And then you discover there are cultures that don't have that. So for example, let me give you a list of words that do not exist in the Tanakh and do not exist in Chazal. By Chazal, I mean, let's say through the Talmud, okay? There's no word for history. There's no word for fact or fiction or religion or belief or law. This makes the world very interesting because we have to understand. I mean, obviously they wrote about the past, right? And obviously there's emes and sheker, right? Truth and falsehood, but these are not all the same, okay? Now, to your question, Scott, there's no word for what we call history. And it's not just about Jews, okay? All ancient writers, all those so-called ancient historians, Herodotus, and in the Middle Ages, the Venerable Bede, people who seem to be, they're writing about the past, but what they're doing is under a whole set of different guidelines and rules than what modern historians do. And what they're doing really is a lot more like what Rav Kook said. They are taking the received traditions about the past. There's a core of a story that will never change, but they will embellish the story because what they're primarily doing is chinuch, is instruction, is trying to penetrate the hearts of their listeners, whether it's Romans about civic virtue or whether it's medieval Christians about piety.
Okay, then how did ancients, to the degree that we can understand it at all, regard what we would now call history? In other words, when they were reading the Tanakh, when they were reading these stories, or in other cultures, doesn't matter which one, when they're reading the account of Ramses II about what happened at this battle, what do they think they are doing? We now question whether this is true or false from a unitary point of view. Right. You're saying they did not think like that. So what were they thinking? And frankly, I'll tell you, Rabbi Berman, this is something which I never can really wrap my head around when I've heard this answer before, the idea that, and I understand that it's true, that we nowadays have a different understanding of what history is, or the concept of history is kind of a relatively new phenomenon. So what were people thinking then? I just have a hard time understanding what that means.
Yeah. So today, what happens is this. I mean, I'm sure there are many people saying, no, this can't possibly be what these two men are talking about. Did you know you couldn't even study something called history until 1810? The first history department in the world was in Berlin in 1810. You know, there were universities for many centuries before, places like Cambridge and Oxford. You could study philosophy, theology, medicine, law, not this thing called history. What we have today is a crisis of authority. That means when someone tells us something, we have no faith in what lesson to learn. But what you can do, if I'm talking to an historian, or if I'm opening up a newspaper, is what I will trust you to do, if you have a good track record, is give me the facts. Give me the facts, and then I will do with them what I see best. Tell me about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Tell me about the pandemic. Tell me about climate change. Just give me facts. And of course, I'll read you, and I'll read 10 other people, because I can do that today because I'm sitting next to a keyboard, and we can all check everything really, really quickly. Mm-hmm. And so more and more, we are relying on ourselves to make the message. And we rely, hopefully, on media outlets. We hope, we cross our fingers, that they will give us facts, or at least some of the facts, and then we can make sense of it ourselves.
Right.
Any historian today, we go and check them. We go and check. Historian writes a book, you say, I don't know. Well, let me just go see. First, I look up what Dr. Wikipedia said, and on and on. Okay, this is all very
And that seems like a self-evident thing to do. Like,
yes.
We're so used to that.
We're so used to it. And yet, Scott, you and I are old enough to know we weren't doing this 30 years ago, right? Okay.
Right.
Now, once upon a time, nobody had sources. There was nothing dug up. There was no libraries. There was nothing. There was only the traditions. But more importantly than a lack of resources that we have today, thank God, as far as I'm concerned, that we have all this, it's a great blessing. The more important thing is that when someone wrote, or when someone was listening or reading to something that would look to our eyes and ears as an historical account, what they understood is that what's really, really important here is not the factual accuracy of every little point in this story. That is all secondary to something else. And that is, who is it that's doing the writing? What is his status? And what is he trying to teach me? That's what's really important.
And what does that mean, though? Okay, now I know who wrote it. Why is that important? Why do I care about that?
Oh, because I need to be a good citizen in my society. A good citizen in my society, if you're in Rome, is knowing what civic virtue means. What is demanded of me? What are my fellow citizens going to be aiming for? And therefore, what do I need to aim for? How will I look bad if I do X, Y, and Z? And if you are a religious person, and it doesn't matter whether whether we're talking about Jew or Christian or pagan. When you have a high priest or some other spiritual leader who is writing a treatise or a narrative that comes to teach certain points, as Chumash does, then the way in which people approach this was, oh wow, Moshe Rabbeinu or the Ribbono Shel Olam himself is writing to me to teach me about what is expected of me in his world. What could be more important than that? And if this all sounds incredibly counterintuitive, Scott, and viewers and listeners at home, the best proof that this is always the way in which Jews read Kitvei HaKodesh and all of Chazal is the entire world of Medrash, where on every story you have all sorts of Tanaim and Amoraim retelling the story and embellishing them and making up things right and left. And did you ever notice?
And they knew they were making them up, you say. They knew they were not speaking about fact and history.
Because there was no word history. There was no word fact. What there was the importance of passing on the cardinal values of the Masorah to every generation. That requires tweaking. And this is why in the world of Medrash, unlike in the Gemara, when the Gemara brings arguments, what is the halacha on this? Well, there's a shakla and a tarya, and there's proofs, and oftentimes even at the end. And from this, we conclude that we go like Rava and not like Abai, etc. But that type of striving to figure out which opinion is right, who do we go by? You never find that in the world of Medrash. You never find that the Medrash Rabbah brings 5 opinions and then says, gosh, well, they're all different. They all tell the story differently. Who's right? No. They're not engaged in that. They're not concerned with that. What they're concerned with is promulgating ideas and lessons. And therefore, the most important thing about a Medrash that starts, Amar Rabbi Asa, is that it was Rabbi Asa who was speaking. And we hold by Rabbi Asa. And therefore, we want to learn what he has to tell us.
Here's my question when it comes to this. This is a fascinating approach, but doesn't it become almost a gateway to anarchy? Once I say that history is not the goal and history wasn't even a thing, fact wasn't even a concept per se. So it's one thing to say that Bereshit is speaking about, I don't know if metaphor is the right term, but it's not speaking about a literal creation in 6 days. And similarly, we're not speaking about a literal serpent speaking to a literal human being. Perhaps. I can say that about the Teva of Noach, but perhaps maybe Avraham Avinu didn't exist. Maybe there was never an Exodus. How do I know if there's anything in the Torah which should be taken literally? How do I know where the line is drawn between literary approaches that say this is accurate, something did happen, or when nothing at all happened and the message is all that matters?
Sure. So this is a slippery slope, and Scott, your question is the obvious and important one. And here I would say this, that in the ancient world, all writings that are about, there are writings that seem very mythical. They're about gods and they're about angels and they're about supernatural beings. And, those have a very mythic quality. All the writings that we know from the ancient world that are about earthly beings at set times and places that we all know about, this was in Jerusalem, it was in the 8th century, or anything comparable in Mesopotamian literature, in Egyptian literature, and on and on. We don't see that ancient writers ever wrote this thing that we would call fiction. They wrote some myths about, that were clearly very mythical figures. And I think that this is the same bar, the same level of suspicion or lack of suspicion needs to be brought to the Tanakh as well. The events in the Tanakh largely happen as they are reported. With that, there is room for embellishment. I would say that I want to flesh this out a little bit more. I think that there are really very few places where you can look at a story in Tanakh and say, gosh, this just appears to be symbolic and mythic, me'alef ad taf. The only places that I would say that this is even possible to entertain is within these very parshiot that we're reading now, the first 11 prakim of Sefer Bereshit. I think it's not...
Which is effectively the approach of the Ramban as well. The Ramban more or less says something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're talking about the account of Maaseh Bereshit, Gan Eden, the Mabul, and Migdal Bavel. I find it very interesting. These are events that are stories that are almost never again referenced in the Tanakh. Obviously, the idea of Briat HaOlam is, but the accounts of Gan Eden, not so much. Migdal Bavel, very little. The Mabul, a little bit, but really not that much. Once we get to Avraham, then all of those stories and all of those characters are referenced again and again and again. And it seems that the Tanakh itself is looking differently at the Avot and everything thereafter than it is on the things that came earlier. I would say also that it's clear that the Tanakh itself takes itself seriously in terms of the basic history of what it's describing. How do I know this? Because one can hold up a Tanakh and say, what is this book about? Well, it comes to teach us in broad fashion, demonstrated over and over again over many centuries, that when Am Yisrael does the will of the Ribono Shel Olam, then it is rewarded. And when it fails to do the will of the Ribono Shel Olam, it is punished. Now, in order for that message to hold any water for future generations, it must be that the Tanakh itself considers that Am Yisrael actually did the right thing from time to time and did the wrong thing from time to time, and that Hashem responded. Because if this is all just, then how can we learn anything if that and what I just said is, about Am Yisrael being rewarded or punished depending on its actions? That is a very accurate description of the entire Tanakh. It would make no sense on its own terms if all of that was just myth. You can't learn from that and say, oh, but now today it's really going to work. When Am Yisrael is good, we're going to get rewarded. And when we're bad, we're going to get punished. That only works if that was also true in the source text for these ideas.
Then one of the major challenges that comes not necessarily from within the Torah itself, not from source criticism per se, but from external sources like archaeology, is the question of the historicity of some of the events in Tanakh. And I mean the larger event. I don't mean the specific numbers per se, which, sure, as you've said, can be embellished, can be there to be teaching a reason. Mm-hmm. But for example, the entire narrative of the Exodus, I've heard scholars say, well, if it happened, it was just a few thousand people, and it really wasn't the way it happened here at all because of a lack of archaeological evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not vouching for that approach, but I want to know how you would address that.
Right. I have a lot to say about this. I think that there is tons of evidence for the Exodus. I can't vouch for each and every Makkah, okay? And the whole issue of supernatural things happening, that's more of a philosophical question. But that Am Yisrael were slaves in Egypt and were redeemed in the time of Ramses II, it seems to me there's plenty of strong evidence. I've written a lot about this. It's also in the book, how the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, especially the story of the fleeing from the Egyptians once they're out, and then the whole story of crossing the sea and defeating the Egyptians there. What in our Chumash is Shmot, Perek Yud Daled, and Tet Vav. The way in which the Chumash is written there is clearly polemicizing against the compositions that I mentioned before, the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II. The Torah is clearly familiar with these inscriptions and is kind of turning them on their head to show, you think Ramses is really great, his greatest event against the Hittites? Well, what we're doing to him is even greater than that. There are tons of allusions in Chumash to that. Once you see these inscriptions, it's very clear. In fact, there are actual drawings that we have in several locations in ancient Egypt of Ramses' throne tent. And when you look at the throne tent, its dimensions, its size, what it's surrounded by, wow, it looks an awful lot like the Mishkan, And there are archaeologists that say what the Torah was doing was trying to concretize for Am Yisrael coming out of Mitzrayim, who are not able to see a Kadosh Baruch Hu, who might not even be able to hear a Kadosh Baruch Hu, to kind of depict him in, well, he's kind of like the Ramses the Great, only greater. So I think that there's a lot of evidence for Yetziat Mitzrayim. Let me just say here, let me give a little plug, Scott.
Please.
In Yirtzeh Hashem, in January of 2022, I am taking a group of tourists to Egypt with Tanakh in hand to go see all of these incredible inscriptions and to see the incredible drawings that are all over the place, perfectly preserved, that teach us about a zillion different things in Chumash. This is where it all began. And if anybody would like to join the tour, they can get the details at Kesher Tours with a K. Kesher Tours, it's all right there. And I'll be leading that tour.
Oh, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm going to mention something that you said earlier. You said nearly all biblical critics, nearly all Bible scholars work with the assumption that our understanding of the unitary nature of literature should apply to the Bible, and that is the fallacy as you see it. My question is this. What you say today is very compelling. Why is it that nearly all biblical scholars are disagreeing with you and don't necessarily see it as you see it? Or am I misunderstanding you?
disagreeing with me. It's very interesting, Scott. Okay, let me tell you something about the world of academia. Okay, so I mentioned that my book Ani Maamin is a popular presentation of a book that I wrote in 2017 with Oxford University Press, Inconsistency in the Torah. Okay, ancient literary criticism and the limits, ancient literary convention and the limits of source criticism, which has now been reviewed, I think 13 or 14 times in academic literature. I'm going to tell you the good news and the bad news. Okay, the good news, Scott, is that all of the reviews are positive. That's good news. Let me tell you the bad news. All of the reviews are positive. Okay? That's the bad news. That's bad news. Why is that bad news? Doesn't an author want to see that everybody loves their book? You know what? This is academia, and I'm pulling the carpet out from a lot of people. Why aren't they writing reviews against me? And this is a book published by Oxford that's already been, popularly and positively reviewed by many others. And what happens in academia, unfortunately, Scott, is really no different than what we see in all of society. If you watch Fox News, you probably don't read the New York Times. And if you read the New York Times, you probably don't watch Fox News. We are all looking for the media outlets that merely will confirm what we already know to be the truth. And so I'm sorry to say that I can't point to any scholarly response to my work that is critical of it. I am certain that there are people that don't accept what I say. I am certain that I am not the majority opinion, but this is how this world works. Okay?
I see. I want to ask about your approach and how it relates to Chazal, because on the one hand, there's a question about how a religious Jew can understand the Torah, Tanakh, let's call the Torah, for example, being a single unified document given to us by God through Moshe, etc. Then there's the question of, well, do the approaches that preserve Tanakh's unitary character and unity, do they also jive with the way that Chazal understood it? The way that you explain things such as the numbers, they are not necessarily literal, and so on and so forth. Although it might keep the Torah intact, so to speak, it might also come up as a problem against the words of Chazal. So how do you deal with that balance? And also the Rishonim as well.
That's a very important question. Look, our Torah is very ancient, okay? And it's been interpreted by our Gdolei Yisrael ever since, starting with Moshe Rabbeinu, his own interpretations of things, which we can see in Sefer Dvarim, to the ways in which Nevi'im understood Chumash. We can see that by the way in which they quote Psukim and sometimes change things around. And obviously on through Tanaim and Amoraim and Rishonim and into our own time. And the truth is that it is not possible, Scott, for anyone to make one harmonious picture of all the views that are now part of our Masorah. Our Masorah is a big tent of many different views that don't really all hang together in terms of their conceptual coherence. They hang together as, this Shivim Panim LaTorah. There is the halacha that we follow, which sometimes follows Kabbalah and sometimes doesn't follow Kabbalah. This Shivim Panim LaTorah. Shivim Panim LaTorah doesn't mean just at any one time you and I might have a machloket about something, or a different way of looking at things. It's also a recognition that at different periods in history, Gdolei Yisrael looked at things in different ways that don't always jive together. So this is not an issue of, Berman, you have a way of understanding Chumash that doesn't necessarily jive with the way the Maharal did. But you know what? The way in which the Rambam looked at everything doesn't necessarily jive with the way the Maharal did, or the way in which a Medrash did. So this is all, what I try to demonstrate is that the way in which I am this type of approach of looking at how people used to think and write in the ancient world is which sounds very modern, has deep roots, especially in the Rambam and other Rishonim as well, that we've kind of lost touch with in recent centuries. So I have legs upon which to stand. They're not everyone's legs. But then again, no approach that we have to almost anything in our Masorah is agreed by everybody. Except, of course, the contours of the halachic system. And in the end, that takes a little bit from here and a little bit from there.
In that case, let me ask about something which you wrote in your book. You point out in Ani Maamin that, I say your book, obviously you have more than one book. I'm referring to specifically Ani Maamin, your most recent popular work. You say that nowhere does the Talmud actually assert that belief in revelation of the entire Torah as we have it to Moshe by God is a principle of faith. And indeed, Professor Menachem Kellner from Haifa has pointed out that the concept of principles of faith is something which originated with, well, certainly after the time of Chazal and time of the Gaonim or the early Rishonim. While the Talmud certainly does assume that the entire Torah was given from God to Moshe, that's stated explicitly, nonetheless, it's not presented as a principle of faith per se, as we understand that terminology today. Yes, the Mishnah in Perek Chelik of Sanhedrin does imply something that's like a principle of faith, but not, according to the pshat of the Mishnah, the way that the Rambam would formulate it as principles per se. So my question for you is, what is the role of principles of faith for a believing Jew? Or in different terms, is it necessary for an Orthodox Jew to accept the Rambam's eighth principle, namely that God gave us the Torah through Moshe?
Yeah, so the whole issue of principles of faith, the whole second half of the book is about this. I don't go as far as Professor Kellner, who, as I understand it, says, well, this hasn't been really accepted, and we can, there's a lot of flexibility with it. I think that principles of faith for 1,000 years have played an important role, and continue to play an important role. Having said that, I want to point out a few things, and that is that it is fascinating to me that we don't have one single canonized version of what those principles of faith are. So, we have a Mishnah. Everyone agrees. We can all agree what the language of the Mishnah is on every Mishnah. Okay, there's a word here, word there, kitvei yad, manuscripts, but 99.9%, we know what the Mishnah is. We know what the Shulchan Aruch is. We know what the Mishnah Brura is. We know what the Rambam is. When we speak about the Gimel Ikarei Emunah, it is remarkable how many different versions of text we're talking about, and no one ever really tried to pin it down. It's also interesting to me how vastly different approaches Gedolei Yisrael have taken to them. Just that previous point, by the way, that we don't even have a set text. When you look at what the Mekubalim did with the Ikarei Emunah, I'm thinking of especially the Shla, the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, or the Ramchal, for that matter, in one of his works. They all come to very, very varying interpretations of just what those Ikarei Emunah are. Even the Rambam, even about the eighth Ikar Emunah, which you cited, Scott, about Torah Min HaShamayim, I think that there are significant differences between his expression of it in what many would say is kind of the earliest text of this, which is his Hakdama, his introduction to the 10th parak of Sanhedrin, where he lays out about 5 different aspects of what he thinks go into Torah Min HaShamayim. And then you look at it in the Mishnah Torah, where he discusses this in Hilchot Yesodei Torah and in Hilchot Tshuva, and there are differences there, and he seems to have changed his opinion about some things over time. I'll leave readers. We have to leave something for people to read in the book, Scott. So I'll leave that there. But I would say that given the various different texts which people point to, or the various different formulations that people point to, and if you think that what you have in the Siddur is the authoritative, you go to the last page of your Siddur, it says, Rabbi Berman, it's right here. We don't even know who wrote that. We don't know who wrote that. We don't know who wrote the Ashkenazi version of that, and we don't know who wrote the Sephardic version of that, and it certainly wasn't the Rambam. Nobody holds that it was the Rambam.
Right. It doesn't even agree with the Rambam.
It doesn't even agree with the Rambam, yeah. Beyond the differing formulaic expressions of the Ikarei Emunah, the vastly different ways in which Gedolei Yisrael have themselves viewed the Ikarei Emunah. Some Gedolei Yisrael didn't like the Ikarei Emunah at all. The Ma'arik and Rav Shalom Shachna, who was the Rav of the Ramah, they didn't like the idea of Ikarei Emunah at all. They said, we don't really want people reciting this, and we don't want people singing, Yigdal, which is based on the Ikarei Emunah, because what happens is that people stop doing mitzvahs. They think all they need to do is believe. So it's been a very interesting journey over time, and the Ikarei Emunah have played a far greater role in the last couple of centuries as kind of a benchmark of who's in and who's out. But I think that all of these opinions, all of these formulations, I can really sum them up in a single sentence where there is unity from wall to wall. And that is that all Gedolei Yisrael, since the Rambam onward, their view of the Ikarei Emunah has always been guided by one principle, and that is, given where I, the various Dolei Israel, where I am living, the time that I am living in, the community that I am addressing, what is their spiritual needs? What do I need to tell them about the Ikarei Emuna or any one of them that will lead them to greater Yirat Shamayim and Kiyum HaMitzvot? Full stop. It just turns out that at different times, different Gedolim have told different people different things. But that is what has always guided them. And that's what guides us today as well.
Okay, we don't have too much time left, but there's a question I want to ask you, and that is what I might call perceived immorality that appears in the Torah. Let me give an easy example. In Bamidbar, Perek Lamed Aleph, the war with Midian, and people come back after having killed all the men. Basically genocide, let's call it what it is. They've killed all the men in Midian. There were 5 kings. It wasn't just 10 people. They go kill all the men, and Moshe gets angry with them. And he says, what do you mean you left all the women alive? So now kill all the little boys, all the male children, doesn't matter how old they are. And any woman who has had intercourse, you have to kill her as well. And Chazal even say that means any woman old enough to have intercourse. And the only people who can be left alive are, according to the simple pshat, I suppose, women who are virgins. That is a very troubling passage, and there are others like that, both in the command to kill the 7 nations, the command to kill Amalek, and the historical approach, I'm using that term carefully, that is described in the parak I just mentioned. What would you say to somebody who's bothered by something like that?
Yeah, I would say that morals are changing all the time. All the time. We know this, Scott, in our own lifetime, okay? The way in which our own community speaks about sexual preference and orientation is vastly different than the way it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, and is moving all the time. All right. And, we look today and we say, wow, how could people have thought or not thought those things 20 years ago? That was us. That was us. Right. We have changed in our own lifetimes, our own short, brief lifetimes on this earth. Okay. Now, if we are changing our morals as we speak, okay, then should it surprise us that morals have changed over time as well? I mean, I think that even Chazal clearly recognize this. I'll just give one example, okay? It's clear from the Torah that the Torah views Yibum as a beautiful and important mitzvah. The situation where a young couple, the man has passed away and they didn't have children. And now the Torah encourages one of the brothers of the deceased to marry the young widow, okay? And it's very clear that that's what the man is expected to do. And if he doesn't do it, then we boosh him out, we embarrass him publicly with chalitza, okay?
Chalitza is supposed to be embarrassing for him, exactly.
Exactly, yes, because this is the way in which we perpetuate the name of the deceased. This is the way in which we provide a guarantee of protection for the woman. This is a great thing. All of Megillat Ruth is one big championing of this mitzvah Yibum, that all the events, the Kadosh Baruch Hu, organizes all of them, so they all funnel into the final pseudo Yibum that Boaz performs with Ruth. We don't have another mitzvah anywhere where there's an entire book devoted to a single mitzvah. Now, that said, what you find is that by the time we get to the Gemara, and the Gemara discusses Yibum and Chalitza, it totally changes the meaning of the verses, so that when it says v'dibru elav ziknei iro, that when the Zikanim speak to the potential Yavam, which in Chumash clearly is, you know what you need to do. We want you to do this. This is important for society. In Gemara, it turns out, in Yevamot, what the Gemara says is they say to him, the words that the elders spoke to the man is, are you sure you want to do this? Is your current marriage strong enough for this? This is a total turning things on their head, because by the time of Chazal, monogamy is now the norm. People have enough money monogamy is a luxury. Only cultures that are well off financially have this. So what you see is that even within the Masorah, values are constantly changing. And it's a mistake for us to think that everything in the Torah, all the values that are in the Torah, especially social, societal values, are set in stone. Yes, the Torah is the word of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, but it's not the final word of God. It's the first word of God, and it's given over to Gedolei Yisrael in every generation, depending on the things that are changing, to adapt the message of the Torah for the times, and that includes some of the values.
And you take that as far as even saying that, okay, once upon a time, killing all the men and women as well was an okay value. That's a value which we could accept.
Yes.
All right. Okay.
We would need to understand, what that meant back then, what it means today. But yeah, I think so. I don't want to be judged. Okay. It's hard to judge people by a standard that's vastly different than their own time. Okay. And I take, hopefully, humbly speaking, a little bit of pride, all of us, that we're open to some change about the issue that I mentioned before, about how we view people who have a different sexual orientation than the majority do, our notion of gender and what women can do and should do, whether we're talking within the shul, outside. These things are changing all the time, and I think that we all recognize that a sensitive, slow process is probably the way to go.
So before we go, I want to ask you on an educational, pedagogical level, whether you think that books like yours, you mentioned how in the yeshivish world, they're not suggesting that everyone put it on a stender yet, but do you think that people should look at academic approaches to the Torah and to Bible as a means of bolstering faith? Or is it something which a person should only really approach, and books like yours only read, if they're already bothered by something which they've already read on the internet or elsewhere? How should a person approach this?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer that all of this stuff is not just for people who are struggling. I think that there is a tremendous amount of ancient context for the Torah that produces beautiful, beautiful insights that really just contribute to our avodas Hashem, whether you're struggling or whether you're not. There's a question of, what and when to introduce and at what age, etc. But I've had a lot of people who have said to me, I read your book. It was kind of interesting to me. It's not that I was struggling at all, and it's just opened up so many ways of thinking about our avodas Hashem, and that's exactly what I wanted.
So as a final word, Rabbi Berman, what would you tell people right now who are listening, who are interested in academic approaches, and perhaps they've even read some academic approaches? Would you encourage them to continue their searching even beyond your book, perhaps look at books which don't have the same traditional approach that you have? Or would you say, stop before you get in trouble? How would you think? What do you think is the right approach?
I think that always I think that it's the only way to serve a Kadosh Baruch Hu is la'avdecha be'emes. We have to serve with the midah of truth, which is something which is a blessing that the Rebbeinu Shalom gave for us. And to tell anyone curtail your search of truth is never a way to go. Okay, I think having said that, what I would say to viewers and listeners is, as we all know, on any topic out there, wow, there's an amazing range of opinion. And you can read something that seems very compelling, but until you have read the counter arguments by equally proficient authorities on the other side of the issue, then you won't be getting the full picture. And I would just say that, anything you read, that you have to search around to see, is there some defendant of the Masorah who has something compelling to say? That's what I would say.
This has been very, very enlightening, and I appreciate your time, Rabbi Professor Joshua Berman. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Scott, and Shana Tova to everybody. Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, the Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.